Last weekend, we had some sun in London which, although only lasted for 3 days sadly, it was a rare event worth celebrating, and so I went ahead and shot a roll of Epi 4 and some Neopan Acros by Fuji. Okay, so the Epi 4 is done. Now I'm gonna have to take it out and put in this roll instead. This is the other roll of Fuji that I also left in my bag for one day in this heat. Let's hope that it's alright. This is the first time I've ever took out film anywhere outside of my house. Great. Just to play safe, I'm gonna keep this roll inside of this packaging so that it doesn't fall out. And here we go, the second roll. Just quickly pop that in there. This roll, I believe, is expired in 2014, but it's been stored in frozen conditions, and so we just assume that it's gonna shoot at box speed. Okay, so it now says 1. Right next to where I sat down to load my film, there was a football pit. On the left, there was a boy practicing on his own. I especially liked how he was moving the cones around to assign himself different moves. The issue though, as I was visualizing my shot, was that the football might not stand out sufficiently from the ground because it was very bright as well. So I waited for him to do one of these kicks, which sent the ball into mid-air, and I took the shot. On the other side, there was a father playing with his 2 sons. I instinctively liked the scene. It was about a father bonding with his sons via football. At one point, the father left the pit because it was tough playing against his young sons, I assume, and 3 kids eventually took over the pit together. I wish I had more time to focus my camera before this happened. This shot was completely out of focus, but I'd say it was definitely a good try. I was just about to walk past actually after loading my camera, but then I caught this scene and I thought it truly reflected how passionate those kids were about football. And I also spotted a tiny England flag that's hung in the houses behind. When the Euro Cup was happening, apparently it's really hyped up, but now that it's over and England didn't win, a lot of that excitement has died down, and I thought that scene really showed just how passionate one truly can be about football, and so I was willing to spend so many frames on just one situation. Somehow, this tree stump begged a lot of questions. Why was it cut off? Why was it there in the first place? So I moved myself around to get an angle that I liked and focused on the details of the stump. I think someone must have intended to grow some plants here, thus the pots, both the rounded ones on the floor and the rectangular ones on the wall. But not only are there no plants, the pots were actually cracking and falling apart from the weight of the soil. Intuitively, the structure of pulls and handles combined with a colored wall has much potential for exploration. People were walking across the bridge and casted all sorts of interesting shadows onto the wall. I shot this roll of Neopan Acros immediately following the FE4, so basically the 2 rolls were shot in the same setting. If you haven't watched my video last week on the FE4, here it is. Though the implication here is that the methodology that I've used on both films are technically the same. I was mostly just focusing using this viewfinder on top of my TLR, so I wasn't using the sports viewfinder, nothing. I was just watching the scene through this viewfinder, which, as I've mentioned in my previous video, could be a little bit tricky in terms of nailing the focus, which is why the first thing that I was really surprised about when I got these photos was how sharp they were. Okay, so to be fair, I was doing quite a bit of still life in this roll, and perhaps maybe in those situations, I was under way less stress and pressure to get a shot done ASAP. But then even for shots involving people, I think that, well, at least it's an impression that it came out much sharper. For example, in this shot, the focus was supposed to be on the pots in the center of the frame, but then even if you look at the breaks on the walls, on the edges, you can still clearly see the lines that define every single brick, which I think is pretty amazing. This thing in relation to the grain should not really come as a surprise based on how this film stock, Neopan, is being marketed as being really ultra fine grain. But that being said, I was still in awe in terms of how the grain turned out when I saw the images. The grain isn't just fine, it's virtually non-existent. I mean, there are a ton of film stocks out there which also market themselves as being fine grain and soft grain, but then this has really set the bar very high for what it means to be a fine grain film. Now, if you look at those images, the grain is virtually invisible in the shadow areas, which in this instance makes sense because I was exposing for mostly the shadows. I didn't actually just expose the shadows though. I think I accidentally gave it a few more stops of illumination, which definitely has helped reduce the grain in the shadow areas. But then even for the highlights, which typically would produce a level of graininess if it's being way overexposed, showed really manageable levels of grain. As you can see from the original film scans, these shots were actually terribly overexposed. I shot all of these wide open on 3.5, but then the sun was really intense that day and it was like sunny all the way. I would assume that the highlights would have blown out quite terribly, and by bringing those highlights back, I was expecting some level of grain at least. I mean, it's film after all and you do see grain apparently, but only in areas where it's actually very bright, for instance the sky, where I was basically pointing my camera into the sky. For other parts edging towards the midtones, the grain again is barely visible, which I think is fairly impressive. Another reason why these scans turn out to be really clean and really neat, as some might put it, it's because of the way the colors graduate. Especially with the vegetation, the tones are transitioning really smoothly from dark greens to yellows. This can also be, depending on how you see it, a weakness in a film in the sense that it doesn't give that much contrast because you don't necessarily see strong crushed shadows right next to speculative highlights. And low contrast is certainly something that you can complain about if that's what you're looking for in a film, though my theory that accounts for this smooth gradation has to do with the film's sensitivity in relation to different colors. I'm gonna pull out the spectral sensitivity chart of the Neopan Acros as provided by Fuji. In simple words, this curve shows you which colors the film is the most sensitive to. For the colors that the film is the most sensitive to, they might appear lighter or brighter than they actually are from the resulting negative, whereas for the colors that the film is not so sensitive to, they might render to be darker than they actually are. For now, let's concentrate on the range that corresponds to green to yellow. In mathematical terms, that will translate into approximately 550 nanometers to 600 nanometers. And as you can see, the sensitivity gradually increases from green to somewhat light green and then shows a dent at 600, which is the yellows. I think this is really smartly designed. If you think about it, when you're photographing vegetation under harsh light, it mostly is going to be the case where the darker parts of the vegetation, so the shadow parts, are going to be reflected as greens, whereas the areas which are hit by the sunlight would reflect as yellows. So effectively, what the curve does here is to lower the values of the yellows, so basically offsetting some of those strong highlights and also lifting some of the tones in the middle, so as to result in a really smooth transition in the vegetation, at least in a use case of shooting trees and plants under harsh sunlight. Speaking of spectral sensitivity, there are two other ways in which I think that this film is really smartly designed. The first being the dip in the blues. I think Fuji has definitely put quite a bit of thought into it in terms of covering the typical usages of an ISO 100 film. I mean, think about it, under what circumstances would you shoot an ISO 100 film on? It certainly has to be a sunny day, in fact a very sunny day, just like what I've been doing in this video. And under lighting circumstances like this, The sky is exceptionally vulnerable to being totally blown out and reflecting as pure white and, pure nothingness in the print, which is of course not desirable. As you can see from this dip, around the 500 nanometer wavelength, which corresponds to blues, is a really thoughtful design on the part of Fuji to make sure that the skies, however bright they might be in real life, do not reflect as pure whites, because I think it could be quite distracting and does not look aesthetically pleasing to have a blank area in the top of your frame. Another application that I think the Neopan would be really good for is portraits under strong light. This has to do with the film's sensitivity, specifically in relation to the reds, the oranges, and sometimes the yellows. Going back to the curve, we see that the sensitivity slightly dropped in relation to the yellow color, as we've seen, gradually picks up and then drops abruptly when it ventures into the territory of red. This, I think, is really helpful in terms of preserving skin tones. There were quite a few frames involving people that I didn't have footage for, unfortunately, and this being one. So in this image, the sun was actually setting, and so it was hitting at a really low angle. Somehow the skin tone was managed to be saved. I'm not sure if I could totally accredit this to the sensitivity curve, but I do think that it has a role to play. In another frame, here is a portrait of a friend playing chess. I mean, depending on the skin color, but then human skin is mostly made up of red, yellows, and oranges. Lowering the reds actually is something that I would do anyway, even if I'm working with digital files, if I want to translate the color into black and white values. Personally, I think that it served the portrait well to drop the value of reds slightly lower, because it separates the lips from the rest of the skin. And I think that by doing so, the contours and the shadows of the face would be made more pronounced. This is just a matter of personal preference, but I do think that the way the film is designed works good for portraits, especially for lighter skin that's being shot under harsh sunlight. It was, in fact, quite an interesting experience to shoot firstly the FE4 immediately followed by the Neopan, because these two, even though they're always compared together, are in fact quite very different films, which are from very different creeds within the entire film family, if you will. This is not a comparison between the two films. Like I said, I was shooting very different things on the two rolls, but definitely check out the video that I did on the FE4 if you haven't already. As usual, all the shots will be lined up in the back of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!